Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics, where we celebrate the breadth and the depth of the comics medium by looking at some of our favorites. And a very warm welcome to a very special episode of Recent Reads and New Acquisitions, a series of videos in which I look at some new arrivals to my comics collection. This is a very special episode because in this video, I will be talking exclusively about 4 Indian comics. Although I'm based in India, I've never dedicated a complete episode exclusively to Indian comics, primarily because I don't read that many Indian comics, although I have mentioned several of them in various other videos of mine, including my 15 shelf complete comics collection tour, as well as other episodes of Recent Reads and New Acquisitions. So although in this episode I'll be talking about a handful of comics that I've recently read or acquired and am going to be reading, I will start the episode with a brief mention of some of those other Indian comics that have been mentioned or featured in other videos of mine. That's quite a lot to get through, so let's jump right into my Recent Reads and New Acquisitions Indian Comics edition. Like most of my recent reads and new acquisitions videos, not all of the comics I'm going to be talking about today are new publications. It's just me getting around to reading them in the recent past. And because it is very arbitrary, because it's completely determined by when I'm getting around to reading these comics, I also don't want to give the impression that these are the first or the most famous or the most groundbreaking foundational Indian comics there are out there. Some of the other Indian comics I've talked about before include the anthologies Long Form and Verite, as well as Mixtape. I've shown some comics from independent publishing houses Kokachi as well as the Blue Jackal Collective. There are the 2 longer works by Sumit Kumar, an Ichukan Scratch, as well as Amarbadi Tomarbadi Nokshalbadi. There was Amruta Patel's Kari and Sarnath Banerjee's The Barn Owl's Wondrous Capers. And as I mentioned earlier, you can catch me talking a little bit about them and catch glimpses of them on not just my shelf videos, but also my Indie Comics Fest and my Indie Comics Haul video. If you haven't caught these videos, I'll link them in the description below. Today, I'd like to take a very quick look at The Age of Immortals, written by Ram V, illustrated by Saumin Patel, and published by Holy Cow Entertainment. The Piano, written and drawn by Nandita Basu and published by Penguin India. Vyasa, written by Sibaji Bandyopadhyay and illustrated by Sankha Banerjee, also published by Penguin India. Sudershan Chimpanzee, written by Rajesh Devraj, illustrated by Meren Imchen and published by Hachette, or Hachette, I think someone told me, I'm not really sure. And the last comic I'm going to be looking at is actually a webcomic. This is Karejwa, published at buckermax.com, based on a short story by Varun Grover, illustrated by Ankit Kapoor and edited by Sumit Kumar. Let's start with The Age of Immortals by Ram V and Saumin Patel. Ram V is becoming quite a big name these days with Savage shows from Vault Comics. He's done a couple of Batman comics and more coming up. This is from when he used to work with Holy Cow Entertainment, an Indian comics publisher who's been around for a long time with an extensive backlist that they impressively keep every issue in print. So although there is a long history of characters and a deep mythology that Holy Cow has created, they're always available to purchase for new readers to jump on. Now, beyond these stories, I haven't read much from the Holy Cow universe, but I was assured by the publisher that this was a good place to jump on and a good standalone story to read. So I picked up issues 1, 2, and 3 of The Age of Immortals, which seems to be nested within a larger story called Agori. So Age of Immortals 1 is actually Agori number 14, Age of Immortals 2 is Agori number 15, and Age of Immortals 3 is Agori number 16. I was a little intimidated because of the long and complex histories that these comics generally would have, but luckily there is a story so far encapsulation on the inside front cover. Age of Immortals deals with a mystical, magical story of revenge and redemption. It has quite a lot of supernatural and mysticism in it, with some very unique liquid art and bright colors. What I found compelling about this story is how it marries the modern world to this ancient mythic kind of storytelling. The characters do live in our time, but For large parts of the story, it could feel very timeless, it could feel in another dimension, and it feels very steeped in Indian mythological elements while actually being full of new creatures and stories. This mix of modern and mythological, the feeling of this classic ancient magic world within our own time frame and with characters who are our contemporaries, I think is what Holy Cow's universe is based around. From what I can tell in just these issues, the themes are as modern as they are ancient, with primal forces and human greed and avarice right next to each other. To be perfectly honest, whether it's in Indian comics or American comics, I don't really get into very deep mythology comics. I don't mean mythological from the point of view of storytelling, but where the comics themselves have a lot of backstory and very intricate rules of a universe, especially when they have to deal with magic. And that tends to be because, with all the focus on magic and monsters the way this story has, I often feel that characters and human relationships take a back seat, which makes it hard for me to engage with the story. What I found interesting in this story was that the smaller, quieter exchanges were far more powerful for me than the huge monster fighting or the incredible powers that are going to destroy the universe. But there's no doubt that it is a rich universe, that there is a lot of intricacy in there. And of course, those are just my tastes. You might be someone who's very interested in these kind of things. Comics like East of West, for example, that was a comic that I could never quite get into, but I know that people loved it. Marrying that kind of storytelling to some very Indian themes and some very Indian settings, I think Age of Immortals is a great comic for people to try out to get that particular flavor of Indian storytelling within a larger framework that they may already be familiar with. Next is Vyasa, which is the first book in a long series but published as a graphic novel by a company like Penguin, unlike Holy Cow, who brings out these single issues. Vyasa's subtitle is The Beginning, and it is a retelling of the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, if you're not familiar, is a massive epic poem telling of a huge war between cousins. It's a sort of a family war which contains within it incredibly rich themes and some of the most interesting characters. As a child, I found the Mahabharata as an epic to be far more fascinating than the Iliad or the Odyssey or even the Norse or the Sumerian legends because of the complexity that the characters have. And although I haven't finished this volume, what I can tell is that this retelling or this adaptation of that epic keeps that complexity. This is very much a story for adults. It doesn't sanitize or Baudelarize any of the things from the ancient epics. There is lust, there is anger, there is greed, there are all kinds of manipulations and machinations that were honestly what made the epic Mahabharata so interesting for me. And they're all presented over here with some really lovely art. There's a deep richness to the storytelling techniques over here as well, with a narrative and a nested narrative with people talking about stories that they have heard. And like all great epics, this comic gets across this idea that storytelling is one of the most important things there is in most stories. Just the way that Age of Immortals took a mythic and mythological approach to a modern world, Vyasa seems to take a very modern approach to a mythological retelling. There are a lot of exchanges over here that sound very contemporary. They don't sound staid and bogged down in old language, which is what makes it such an exciting read. I look forward to finishing this book, but being more than halfway and not even getting to where the Mahabharata really kicks off, I can just imagine that this is going to be multiple volumes to tell that full epic story. Next up is The Piano by Nandita Basu. This is a slim, all ages comic that is written and drawn by Nandita Basu, the only book I'm looking at today that is written and drawn by the same person. It's subtitled The Story of a Friendship. It starts off with a first person narration talking about the friendship between a girl and her piano, but then flashes back to the creation of this piano in Leipzig, Germany, and then traces the history over European and Indian history of this piano until it ends up with the girl who's telling us the story. There's a very unique approach over here between first person and third person narration. There are obviously parts of the story that cannot be known by the person telling the story, yet they're presented as biographical facts, as historical facts. And there is a very impressive, sweeping vision of history for something so slim. Traversing many countries and featuring dozens of characters, it has a classic children's book feel, kind of like Black Beauty, where you follow one character over various adventures, various people, until you get to the final resting culmination point. The layout and design, I thought, was quite complex, flipping between smaller panels and large full page splashes effortlessly. The art style seems playful and sketchy. I think it matches the story in interesting ways. Although it is expansive in its scope and ambition, it does also feel very intimate and personal. It feels less polished perhaps than what we are used to seeing, but that gives it an intimacy and a handmade indie feeling. And Nandita Basu, regular viewers may remember, is one of the people that we met at the Indie Comics Fest. What I didn't mention at that time is we discovered then that we had been classmates many decades ago. The Piano is published by Penguin under their Duckbill imprint, so it's a major publisher putting out something that looks and feels very much like an indie comic. These are the kind of comics that Nandita would self-publish and distribute at the Indie Comics Fest, but the fact that a major publisher would take a chance on something more intimate, something more homegrown, definitely feels like a positive step. Which is also the way I felt about Sudershan Chimpanzee. Perhaps the most experimental, perhaps the most abstracted, the most unique comic of the ones we're looking at right now. Not to put any of the other ones down in any way, but this comic is the biography of a chimpanzee who was a big Bollywood movie star in the 1960s. It tells the story of his rise and fall in an epic tragedy, but it's set in an India in which animals talk and were, for a brief period of time, quite famous in the movies. This use of anthropomorphic animals is quite unusual. It's not like the whole world is full of animals the way we've seen in certain comics, and it's not radioactivity or magics that's transformed certain animals. It's a very curious mixture of where they are animals, they do interact with human beings, they are treated as animals, but at the same time they can own property and wear clothes. I was trying to think about what else I've seen that's something like this, and the television show BoJack Horseman is about the closest thing I could think of. But this is also a dark and very adult story. There's a lot of commentary about human beings and the way we treat each other. There's a lot that it has to say about the film industry, and it's very clever. The puns, the language, the jokes within it disguise it almost as a funny story, but the artwork, the scratchy darkness, the dirtiness, the grunginess of it is perfectly fitted to this rather strange tragedy. There's a lot in the story that I found very impressive. It's not always consistent, but it's so ambitious and it's so uniquely done that I found it quite unlike anything else I've seen in Indian comics. This was published in 2012 by Hachette, again, a big publisher, so I'm rather surprised that they took a chance on something so odd and so unique. I'm not sure if it's very easy to get one's hands on it. I did find it on Amazon quite easily myself, but it's a comic that I would really recommend to everyone who's interested in something a little different, different, something a little odd, but also very entertaining. This was recommended to me by Sumit Kumar, the founder and editor of Buckermax, and I can completely see what he enjoys in it so much. It has the same sort of irreverence and scathing analysis of society covered in humor that Buckermax is famous for. Which takes me to the final comic for this video. Obviously not a new acquisition since it's a webcomic, but definitely a recent read. Edited by Sumit Kumar on his website buckermax.com, which all of you can visit and go read right now. Karejwa. One of the many interesting things about Sudershan Chimpanzee is its use of language. Although it's completely written in English, it features both English and Hindi. That's because all of the Hindi dialogue and the conversations, the slang, the colloquialisms, they're extremely important to the story and to the feel of it. It wouldn't quite sound the same in English, but it's written in the English alphabet. So it's not as if the text of the story is switching between English and Hindi script. It's all in English Roman alphabet, but the words themselves that are being sounded out are often Hindi. This technique is a really good one because one, it represents, I think, fairly accurately the way a lot of Indians speak. We tend to go between languages even within one sentence. We switch vocabulary and switch terminology according to whatever we are more comfortable with, whatever is most efficient and whatever is most engaging. So there will be a sentence that will start in English, go off into Hindi in order to have a particular expostulation, then come back into English, or be the other way around where you're speaking mainly in Hindi, but then you hit certain words in English just because the Hindi word for it would be way too obscure or way too funny to sound out. This is taken to another level in Karejwa. As soon as you get to this webcomic on the Buckermax website, you're faced with a choice of reading it either in Hindi, which is in Hindi script, in English, or in Hinglish, which is Hindi but written in English Roman script. This also speaks to something that's kind of common in India, where people may be familiar with a language, even fluent in it as far as speaking it is concerned or listening to it, but not so much in reading and writing it. I myself am one of those people where I can understand Hindi and I can understand Bengali quite comfortably, but I would have difficulty and be really slow in reading and writing them. And so even though the Hindi parts of Sudershan Chimpanzee, or if you were reading Karejwa in Hindi, would mean that you need to know that language, the fact that it's written in the English script means that you only need to have one type of familiarity with the language, not a complete fluency, including reading and writing. Karejwa is a terrific and accomplished story. I think it's based on a short story by Varun Grover that has been adapted by illustrator Ankit Kapoor and editor Sumit Kumar. The world is about to end in half an hour, and it tells the story of one young boy's desire to have one sweet before the world ends. And from this simple setup, we get an impressively expansive story, one that includes a history of the city, the history of food. There is social commentary about the media and how something like this would be covered. There is desperation and comedy right next to each other. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I'm not really a digital comics reader, but webcomics that are designed for being read online are a different matter altogether. Unlike the comics that we've seen over here and the ones that we usually talk about in print with the double page spread, this is created to be read as a single scrolling experience, and a lot of the design and illustration work is actually perfectly engineered for that scrolling experience. There are also some tiny parts of this comic that are slightly animated, like a little ticker tape that runs underneath a news broadcast, that are just subtle enough to use the medium very well without trying to step into animation, keeping it a comic but an unusual one. Karejwa is available online for everyone to read, and if you read it in English, unlike say Sudershan Chimpanzee, you'll be able to get every single sentence. Of course, there are cultural aspects and in-jokes, but I also think it makes for a fantastic comic about India, talking about things that I find very particular and peculiar to certain class and society, and using it in this tale of apocalypse wonderfully. As I said at the top of this video, these just happen to be the Indian comics that I've read recently. If you're interested in more such videos, let me know in the comments below, and check out my indie comics video, my indie comics haul, as well as my shelf videos for a number of other Indian comics that I've picked up over the years. I'd love to know what you thought of this episode, what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to see me attempt, what you'd like me to do differently. Leave them all in the comments below. Thank you as always for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.